When we describe artists, we typically describe them in terms of their medium, right? Like a musician or a sculptor or painter or poet. But what does it really mean to be an artist, or for that matter, to be creative? Can you be an artist without a medium, for example? How do we think about or describe the creative act? What might life look like if we were to view it as a work of art? In today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast, we discuss these questions and more with special guest Haymitch St. Haymitch is an artist and contemplative who is dedicated to helping others cultivate creativity as a spiritual practice. One of his recent creative projects that we discuss in the episode is his book, Friend of the Devil, a story of mental health, mistakes, and self-forgiveness. If listening to this episode leaves you hungry for more Haymitch, you can find him at his website, stillpoint.life, where you can also check out the Nature of Creation retreat that he's running on February 15th. And we have a link in the show notes if you want to learn more. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous Network and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison. A couple of announcements for you before we get into the episode. If you're looking for comprehensive foundational training in psychedelic-assisted therapy that includes live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space, then check out our courses. We're offering 10% off select courses to PTF podcast listeners. So click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinous.com/training, and you can use the code PTF10 for 10% off. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reid and I talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinous does. If you or someone you know might be interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the links in the show notes or go directly to numinous.com/research, where you can learn more about the trials we're currently running. And of course, if you'd like to support the show, you can do so by leaving us a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, and please share the episode with someone you think might enjoy it. Without further delay, here is our conversation with Haymitch St.
Welcome to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers. It's good to be here with both of you gentlemen.
Thanks, Reid.
We have my co-host Steve, of course, and a special guest, Haymitch. Thanks for being with us, Haymitch.
Yeah, happy to be here. Happy to be a special guest.
Special one.
Special out of the gate. This feels
Very
good.
special.
Yeah, that just came out,
Yeah.
Special guest.
Authentic.
Unfiltered.
Yeah.
But would you mind introducing yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, I would love to, because every time I introduce myself, it's always different. And so I'll be as surprised
Fun.
what comes out of my mouth as anyone listening. My name is Haymitch. I self-describe as an artist, a writer, a contemplative. I'm from Salt Lake City and was born and raised there. The son of a ski salesman and a writer. Yeah, what else can I say about myself? I'm interested in all things creativity. I'm fascinated with the creative process and how it shows up in my life and in the lives of any other beings. I am really into nature. I love being outside, and my theme for the year is patience. I'm trying to tap into capital P patience. It's like behind any sort of circumstance or condition, trying to come from a place of ultimate patience. I think that's what's coming out of me for the introduction today.
Because I'm curious, could you describe what capital P patience feels like compared to little p patience?
Yeah.
Because that resonates, but I'm curious.
Yeah, and as you ask that question, like what it brings up for me too is just realizing in certain texts or literature, like or writers that I tend to lean heavily on. In spiritual circles, a lot of times there's like a capital letter. Like, I guess God is probably like the most culturally relative. Yeah, self, like capital S, self. I'm like not, I'm not credentialed to say like what that is or where that comes from. But for me, yeah, it's like invoking something like a a divine connection to that word, or the divine aspect of what that word is pointing to.
Cool.
Or like like in developmental psychology, or like stages of development, like that causal tier where things just emanate. They're like these characteristics woven into the fabric of the universe. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking of capital P patience in those terms, like something that's just there, and I can, in my better moments, tune my frequency to be coming from that place of patience.
Amazing. It reminds me of what we were talking about a little bit before recording the Ram Dass episode, and how he might describe that as like holding the form and the formless version of that patience, or holding it from that witness place that's beyond like the regular day-to-day patience, but with that perhaps like trust in the capital S self, capital G God, whatever.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it sounds like it's something that's durable and permanent. And I like the way you talked about tuning yourself to it, right? So it's a way of being, or a frequency, like pick your metaphor, the way you want to describe it.
Right.
But something that you don't manufacture from within yourself. If you're manufacturing anything, it's you tuning yourself to something that's a higher order principle, or a foundational principle. Yeah,
and as you're speaking, Steve, it's like bringing up my favorite feeling of the creative process of like that. I think that's why I'm interested in creativity. It's just a construct, or a way of explaining the opportunity of stepping into whatever that is, and letting that move through me, rather than like I used to think that creative ideas were something I was generating, I was creating, and there is some truth to that, but like capital C creativity, I don't know, it feels more like it's not me, right? It's something
channel or something.
Yeah, or something I witness, or am like a wave, like,
you surrender to, or you ride it.
Yeah.
It reminds me of this beautiful description of like creative inspiration that I heard Elizabeth Gilbert say in a talk once. And she, of course, is a very skilled, brilliant writer. But she was talking about, it's as if she's standing on the side of a large hill or mountain, and you can hear in the distance this spark of inspiration coming at you, like something in the wind.
Yeah.
And you can catch it, you can ride it, or it can pass on through, and it may be embodied by someone else for a time, but it's that kind of readiness and openness to it, and then like this surrendered participation, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it can come from anywhere, right? Like it's in my experience, it generally seems to come when I'm least expecting it. I think for me, there's definitely the aspect of practicing art where like I need to like get my hands, like I sculpt. So getting my hands on certain materials regularly is important. But I think that like the best ideas seem to come when my mind and body are like furthest away from sculpting, right?
Yeah,
like I'm just living my life sort of bopping around, and the more present I am in the moment, like the more likely it is for something, inspiration to strike, and capital C creativity to show up and be like, this could change your life. Like if you give yourself over to this idea, it could be everything for a time being.
So the practice fascinates me, aspect of that. And you mentioned being present in the moment. A friend of mine referred to this as increasing the surface area of serendipity.
That's
so
nice.
You provide more opportunities for the muse to strike, or for you to attune to that frequency of creativity with a deliberate practice.
Yeah.
So you're not just sort of sitting in the lotus position all day waiting for, inspiration.
That might be
I suppose you could do that.
Deliberate practice.
But that could be a part of deliberate practice.
Yeah.
But the sculpting, examples fascinated me because I'm not a visual artist, but just maybe having a discipline of, I'm not necessarily feeling any particular inspiration, but I have a practice of sitting at the piano. I have a practice of getting pen and paper and just starting to write, or getting the materials that I sculpt with in my hands. And maybe there's a day where I don't feel attuned to that particular frequency, but I'm not going to have a chance unless I am busy about the business of practice.
Absolutely. And that's what like, so I make these Japanese mud balls.
What are they called?
Yeah.
They're called Hikaru Dorodango.
Okay.
Hikaru Duradango.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Duradango, I've heard you call them as well. That's one word of it.
Yeah.
Sounds like an anime villain.
Right. That's the muse is hitting me right now. I'm like, we need to make this anime.
Right.
Yeah.
Hikaru means shiny, more or less, in the Japanese language. And Dorodango is something like ball of mud or mud dumpling. I've heard it translated. So it's a shiny mud dumpling.
They're beautiful, by the way. And they're on your Instagram that if you are up for sharing, maybe people can check out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Where can they find your art, by the way?
Yeah. So my Instagram is just, I'm always kind of putting random things on. I've only been doing social media for a little while, so I'm still learning the ins and outs of it, but it's just at Haymitch St Stephen, all spelled out. So
Cool.
Saint is SAINT, all spelled out. But yeah, like I'm even catching myself in the fact that I called myself a sculptor, because I think like most artists, for so long you wonder what you are. You don't know. It's not like I was born with this. Some artists know like music is their thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't my experience. I didn't come as a sculptor. I just like making stuff in my own way, and finding that practice of mud balls was like, well, it was just that. It was discovering a practice where I was like, oh, I can do this every day, multiple times a day, even all day long sometimes. And like, what was the phrase? Increase the
surface area
space
of serendipity.
Yeah,
that's my friend John.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of time, I felt like an artist without a medium, right? It's and that just feels like, what am I, right? Like it had its challenges for sure.
That's an interesting feeling to pinpoint, feeling like an artist without a medium.
Yeah. And like some work I've been doing lately is trying to help people like turn their creativity back on. Like it's been hammered out of us, I don't know, through parents or through school or through church or through life.
Corporate America.
Yeah. Like there's so many things that we probably wouldn't describe as like creatively invigorating. But like to turn that back on or like, I guess what I'm saying is I think so many of us are artists without a medium, right?
Yeah.
Like most of us don't have a daily creative artistic practice because we think that's not us, or because we think it needs to be quote unquote good, or it needs to be fill in the blank. But that I've tried to widen my definition of art, so that anything can be art. And I also don't mean to like water down the fine arts or anyone's particular practice, but just that art to me is really anything done full of intention and free of expectation, right? It's like this is what my heart loves. So I jump into it, whatever happens next, like, right? It could be anything.
It reminds me of this semi-related phrase that I heard years ago and comes back now and then and came into my mind this week for some reason, is you are what you love, not what loves you.
Yeah.
And, maybe you're not any of those things, but it's a beautiful reminder of of hinging things on what lights you up rather than outside approval. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That resonates.
Yeah. And so Duradango, just to paint the picture a little more, like how big do these end up? How long does it take to make one?
Yeah, it's generally like 3 inches, 2 to 3 inches in diameter. But I like when I teach people this practice, I tell them to like find what feels good in your hands, right? Like for smaller hands, that might be a smaller mud ball. But not necessarily. Like I've tried to really push the limits of like how big can I make one where it will still like stay together with the amount of moisture. I'll give you guys my super top secret recipe, which is like 2 cups of dirt, half a cup of water. That's like generally a safe place to start. but you'll find pretty quickly how unique every bit of dirt is. Even two patches of dirt that are right next to each other will have different consistencies and different, composite makeups. And so once you kind of start with that mix, you can feel how much, and then the process of making it can take as long as you want. I generally shoot for like between 2 and 3 weeks. I find that that's enough time where essentially what's happening is the water is escaping the ball. And as it's doing that, through a process of just kind of vibrating it, shaking it in your hands.
You're not packing
you're
it
not,
necessarily.
No, you're not really shaping it. It's like if you imagine dropping a pebble in still water. It like has this perfect, pattern of nature, just like perfect 360 degree ripple. It's doing that in 3 dimensions. So as you're shaking it, the centrifugal force of gravity,
like a river to the bedrock or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And that water coming out is what creates like the seemingly perfect sphere. And the process of curing a Dorodango is essentially, once it's dry, once all the water's evaporated, it's quote unquote done. But there are certain like time related aspects to getting it, for example, more shiny. Because sometimes I'll make them and I don't want them shiny. I want more of a matte or rough finish. Or at least, again, like that's my intention. And then I try and let go of any expectation of, I think like Japanese art forms are so good at this. It's just like a practice of imperfection and impermanence, right? Of like, sure, my intention is to make the perfect, marble looking Dorodango, but pretty quickly into that process, you realize like, oh, this one already has a crack, or it has a little pebble in it.
Wabi sabi.
Yeah, exactly. It's like leaning into that imperfection, letting the age and process show itself, and finding beauty in those imperfections.
Cool.
And that's where it goes pretty quickly for me from like an art making practice to a meditative spiritual practice.
It's like what Reid was saying about surrender, and it's like an uncovering process rather than a shaping process. I remember hearing said of a famous sculptor, don't know who, that the sculpting process with him chiseling marble being revealing what's inside.
Yeah.
Right? I just sort of chip away what is not the sculpture, and then the sculpture reveals itself.
Beautiful.
That's how I view working on yourself too, and how I describe, like when teaching yoga or something like that, how I describe the process, one of uncovering the true self, and instead of trying to find it out there and stick it on.
Right. Yeah. And this brings up I'm feeling this inside right now, like that feeling of not knowing I was an artist, because I thought, I don't know, consciously or subconsciously or both, that like being an artist, let's say a sculptor in this case, meant that I needed the technical skill to make it look realistic, right? Like I needed it to appear human, let's say, with like the case of carving out of marble. And at some point I realized, and maybe this is like justifying my lack of technical skill in the fine arts, but like I like abstract shapes more, right? And therefore like any hammer strike, like in a piece of marble, let's say, whatever happens, to me that's interesting, right? Like nature is prepackaged with all these interesting patterns, colors, shapes, textures. And by simply like doing something, by hammering into that chunk of marble, something's going to happen. And that's the practice of like freeing yourself of expectation, rather than saying this needs to look like, like I'm thinking of the David, like, which is a beautiful, piece of art, but like, rather than thinking it needs to look like that, I can just let go and say like, whatever happens.
And that's why perhaps you can describe it as both a meditation and an art form, because I mean, what a way to do art without that pressure of having it needs to look exactly a certain way, or else disappointment, or else what? I mean, what a way to live, right?
Yeah.
Well, it lets you follow curiosity. I mean, your use of the word interesting is interesting.
Yeah.
Right? When you let go of those constraints and you don't have the expectations or the pressures that you referred to earlier about maybe school and parent, these sort of outside pressures coming in, setting expectations for you, this practice seems like it allows you to just sort of follow your interest and follow your curiosity. And without the destination preset, who knows where you will arrive.
Yeah. Which to me, that feels like, this is just my perspective, but I'm like, I think what you just described is like why I love life so much. It's like, it's inherently mysterious and unknown. Like, you can plan and plan and plan, but to me, the most interesting moments are when like everything falls apart. And then
those
what,
are
right?
interesting.
Like that's exactly, that's creativity. Like that's, one of my favorite artists, Oliver Eliasson, there's this video on YouTube where he's talking about his definition of creativity. And he makes a really interesting point that like, now I'm conscious of every time I use the word interesting, I overuse it for sure.
It's a great word.
I think of,
interesting.
what's that movie, Captain Fantastic, where he's like, one of his kids uses the word interesting and another kid is like, like that's against the rules. It's like, be more specific,
We'll get out the buzzer.
Yeah, exactly. Was I feel
this
like
artist that you admire?
Oliver. Yes, thank you. Oliver Eliasson. He says, like creativity is often associated with those creative choices that one makes. Like, I want the thing to be blue versus red. But he thinks that's actually not that way, that's actually like quite rational. That's like intuitive, like based on my biology and the experiences I've had. For some reason, I have a preference for blue or red, right? By his definition, creativity is the consequence of that choice. It's what happens after making that choice as an artist. And I like that because it almost frees me of that need to be quote unquote creative. Like my job is just to be me, right? That's the artist's job, is to like, how do you see the world? Like, what is your rationale or what is your intuition? Make those choices in some chosen medium and then let the consequences, let the chips fall as they may.
Yeah. It helps you let go of that need to be right. Yeah. And the fear of making a mistake.
Right.
It reminds me of one of my favorite Alan Watts rants on like, have you ever seen a misshapen cloud? Have you ever seen a cloud make a mistake? Right? It's kind of what, that it's all perfect might mean. But yeah. But could you, so sometimes you wear a sculpting hat. And sometimes other art, I remember you talking about recently, kind of an experience, an exhibit you had put together for an event that sounded really interesting. Maybe you could describe another art form that you dabble in.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, maybe this is what you're referring to. Maybe it's not. Either way, I hope this is interesting. It was at the Faith Matters conference, sort of this like spiritual focus conference, but it's still a conference, right? So you have, I think in this case, 5,000 plus people coming into a conference center to like listen to speakers, who are generally like interesting to the people who are, like the folks who are coming to this conference clearly have some reason for being there.
Yeah, we love a good conference.
It's good,
not a bad conference.
Yeah.
Like
conferences are great things. When I attended the first conference they did, I loved it. And being like who I am, I remember like being so saturated in the mind that I was like, I just can't listen to like one more speaker. There's too much. I have too much good information coming in. I just need to like sit with this and let it sort of sink in. And so coming into the second year of the conference, I reached out to him and said, hey, can we create like a meditation hall or space? And they thought that was great, and the concept was like, can we let all of that information go from the head down into the heart, or even into the body, into the bones? Can we just have a space where we don't have to do anything? We don't have to get it, right? We don't have to like take notes. We can just like be present and just be. And so the first year I don't know if I've told you about the first year, but I basically, I wanted to do like a Japanese inspired garden. but like there was so many moving parts, and that's like such a high level art form that like I wasn't going to be able to do it justice. What I did find was at a local greenhouse, they were like selling these red banana leaf trees that are like these huge leaf, they're maybe like the trees are like 12 feet tall, but they're like 10 feet wide with these big swooping leaves. And all of them were on clearance for like, $30 or something.
I want some of those.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I bought all of them. They had I think they had like 25 or something. And I was like, I want all of these. And so essentially that's what it was the first year, is I just brought all these big banana leaf trees into the space, put some, nice ambient music on with some like Ram Dass tracks and some Alan Watts tracks and things like that. And just created little spots for people to sit on the floor. And like, I don't know, maybe some people don't consider that art, and I don't honestly care. Like it just comes from that place of like, I want to do this, right? Like, from that place of
like you're cooking a meal for people you care about or something like that.
Yeah. It's truly like in a way, it's a demotion in terms like art from being this like hierarchical sort of like extravagant thing. It's like, well, what if art is just the things we care about and the things we want to do, and can we do those in a beautiful way?
Our sandboxes.
Yeah. And so that was year one, and that there was no budget. They were just like, we'd love for you to do this. We can provide space, but we can't pay for it. And I was like, okay. So I just did it myself, and then I was able to sell the trees to like recoup the costs, and like it was great. It was a wonderful experience. And so then the next year they were like, hey, that was really awesome. We've got some budget this year to like do something like that. So I revisited the Japanese garden, and there's like there's a number of expressions of Japanese gardens. One that you're probably familiar with is the dry rock garden, the Kara Sansui, which really which in Japanese is something like dry landscape. And it's this idea of, you've seen like, or a lot of people just call them Zen gardens, but it's just like gravel that sort of represents water, and then these boulders that are placed in the gravel that represent like islands in the sea, right? That's at least one. There's no clear understanding of what these Japanese gardens mean necessarily, but there is in the Japanese culture, as I've learned it, there's this role called the Ishitate-so, which means like the rock setting priest. And these are individuals who their entire life practice, their life energy is devoted to placing rocks in these gardens in just such a way that it can elicit that sort of empty mind and that space for meditation. And so this was an opportunity for me to like try on the hat of being a rock setting priest and Ishitate-so. So I the way I did it was, I went to, the Redmond salt mine in central Utah, where they make the real salt.
I drink their electrolytes every day.
Oh yeah, they're great. All their products.
Farms,
I can't like promote them enough, like they're great.
They're not even a sponsor, and we're shouting them out.
Free plug.
Let's
get like them.
But they, I got in touch with the guy who runs the mine, and he helped me get 5 of these 1,500-pound salt chunks. And this is ancient sea salt, right? So it's like 150 million years old. And
are you worried about them breaking when you're loading?
Well, I actually had to intentionally. Initially, it was 3 stones, but 2 of them were so big, like 3,000 plus pounds, that we had to crack through them, which took a while. It took some effort.
With like a jackhammer?
We did. How did we do it? We drilled. We had like one of those like 3-foot drill bits.
Yeah.
So we had to do a bunch of holes. And then we took like a concrete saw and kind of...
Then karate chop?
Yeah. Well, basically these little steel wedges. And I had people, smart like engineer type minds that are way smarter than me helping me figure this out. But you take... At that stage, you just take these little wedges, place them in the crack that you've cut, and literally like 3 soft taps, and this huge rock splits open like perfectly down the middle.
Wow.
That wasn't that was after we had tried to push one out of the truck that I had them on, and there was a lift gate, and it just bent the lift gate down. So that ate into the budget a little bit, but
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
so long story short, we set up this dry rock garden, and I built these sort of contemplative benches for people to come in during the conference this last year and just have a place to sit and be empty and be open.
Cool.
We've used the word space a couple times in this particular chapter of the conversation. It's just making me think of the art of making a space,
Yes.
right? So you don't have any preconceived notion of what people will do in the space or with the space necessarily,
Right.
but there is some intention and thoughtfulness about creating the space that will enable people to be present and then have their own creative process. And there's a phrase we use in the therapy world all the time about making space or holding space for people, holding safe space, and creating space in one's own mind, which is one way maybe to think about the meditation practice.
Yeah.
And we've got, our monkey mind, we've got the stories, we've got all these different parts, we've got expectations, we've got fears that are constricting the space inside of our psyche and our soul. And that perhaps it's a creative process, or we enable a creative process when we make space. But I think it's so beautiful to make space for others in this way.
Yeah, amen. And that I think that's another opportunity that we all have, we all inhabit some space. We all live somewhere.
Take up space.
Yeah, and that opportunity to beautify the spaces that we spend time in, I think has a real psychological and spiritual impact and physical impact. How do we design and cultivate and curate the spaces that we spend our time in? I chatted with a neuroscientist I did my graduate studies at Stanford, and so there's all these amazing people there. I felt like a fraud the whole time I was there, but I met this neuroscientist, and it was
Huberman? Just kidding.
No, I wish. Yeah, I'd love to know that guy. I can't remember his name right now, but it'll come to me at some point. We talked a lot about the psychology of architecture, and that's Stanford's such a beautiful campus, right? It was a great place to have the conversation.
I love walking around that place.
Yeah.
It just feels, feels inspiring.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the California weather helps.
Yeah, it's nice. But you take that down to even the our cars or our the simple spaces we inhabit. There's I get excited just thinking about there's so much opportunity to beautify our personal spaces, and then just see what happens. What does that do for the rest of our life?
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic in mental health too. Not just the setting of psychedelic therapy or anything, but I'm thinking about how we all are on this spectrum of sensitivity to our surroundings, kind of innately and by our life's experience, how tuned in we are to that. And it matters. I know for me, I feel a different room very differently. You go into a new space, it's a new feeling. It's almost, and we talk about sometimes in psychedelic therapy or transpersonal therapy, spirituality, the liminal space, the in-between in your transitions and in the unfolding. So anyway, I like the space concept for sure.
And I think, to your point, Steve, I do think that to me is what resonates the most about a Japanese garden is the intentional curation of that space. If you're familiar with bonsai trees, right, or Japanese maples that have been cured in just a way. There's a famous designer, Dieter Rams, who talked about and Dieter Rams is a legend in the world of industrial design. So much of the mid-century modern aesthetic, I think, can be associated with the products that he's created.
Cool name too.
Yeah. He's this German guy, and I heard him. It was on a documentary. I think it's called Objectified. It's about design and architecture. It shows him clipping a bonsai tree, and the way he describes how that trimming goes is he says it's such that it would invite a bird to want to fly down through under those branches because there's space. And I love the analogy of that with our minds of can we cultivate our minds such that the bird just flies right through? Nature just does its thing. We don't latch onto it.
That's
or
cool.
Overanalyze it or whatever. We just let it run its course.
Yeah, like you were saying, Steve, about creating space, clearing space inside inner minds. I think I heard Brene Brown describe it once of you don't empty your mind or quiet it, like silence it. Yeah, you can make it more quiet, but it's more about clearing space. Yeah. And I like seeing it that way. And it does take the pressure off because, having practiced this in many different ways, it's rather difficult to completely empty your mind for a long period of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
It makes me think of one of the trainers in the IFS training that I recently did talked about a cue that you can give people as they're trying to make sense of all the different parts of them, about behaving in ways that are self-defeating, and find compassion or connection to what IFS folks would say, the capital S self. She would use the phrase, can you breathe yourself a little bit bigger than what you're experiencing right now?
Yeah.
So it wasn't to force one part of you to do one thing. It wasn't to judge or stop yourself from thinking or feeling a certain way. It's, let's see if we can just widen the aperture, create a bigger boundary so that there's room for everything that's there, and even more room so that they have room to move, room to change, room to shift, to transform. And hopefully you can do that with sort of the loving awareness of this so-called capital F self, this self that can be curious, right? Can be creative, can be compassionate.
Yeah.
Breathe yourself bigger so you can hold all your parts with compassion. So there's space to play in there. Space for all this stuff we're talking about. The creativity.
Space to see, right? So if you have your hand an inch from your face, almost your entire view is obscured by your hand. You really can't even see the dimensions of your hand. So if you can just put a little bit of space between, where your eyes start and where the hand starts, then you see it and everything else that's there, but was obscured by your hand being that close. So I don't know. I guess I'm being creative with this concept of space.
Steve
it's really
did
fascinating.
Art.
Yeah.
I did art.
But
Look, Dad.
I lost my thought. It may come back. It may not. I'll let go.
Surrender.
Something that comes up there for me is like, this is a bit of like a shift in direction, but I think it's relevant. Like, a lot of the work that I do with spaces, like I use this phrase transformative experiences, right? Like that's my intention with this dry rock, the salt garden that I create is like, can I create a space in which it's more likely that an experience that someone might describe as transformative is likely to occur? There's a lot of ifs in there and a lot of like room for...
You're creating potentialities, right?
Yeah. And I've even... I worked with a friend who was the director of experiential learning at BYU, and we were sort of working on like 12 ingredients to defining a transformative experience. Like, what are the common ingredients that go into making a space like that? And they're not like things they're not like magical things. It's like time in nature, it's like physical suffering, like putting your body on the line. And it's not like you need all 12 of these, but in our theory that's like as of yet completely untested, it seems like it's more likely that these things lead to transformation. And we're doing that like looking back at our lives and the lives of others that we talk to. It's like, it seems like these elements are common to all these. So some of the other ones are like, yes, physical suffering, like a foreign environment, right? Like if you're in the same space,
travel.
You like going down the same road every day. It's so much easier to get up in your head because your mind tells itself, I know these surroundings. But if you take a different route or something, and we've all heard this like sort of cliche advice, but I think it's true that like any sort of, the more foreign the environment, the more likely you are to notice something you've not noticed before.
Yeah.
So there's sort of like, I think the way we laid it out, there's like 4 concrete elements, there's 4 more subtle elements, and then 4, again, like what I'd call causal elements or like capital letter qualities.
Did you publish that, by the way? Because that'd be cool to open source to the academic world, and it's relevant to our field too. We talk about the varieties of the mystical experience a lot, and whether or not a mystical experience, as people define it, is necessary or helpful, for transformation. But I like this, like like what goes into the space itself of transformation. And then, we look heavily at, the components of the individual.
Yeah.
But you really do need the set and the setting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that like, I try and apply this in a creative or artistic way. Again, I don't know that anyone else considers this art, but once a year I do a hike from over the Wasatch Mountains between Salt Lake City and Midway, which is where I now live. And I've done it both directions, but I tend to like from the Wasatch back from Midway up over to Salt Lake City, because I think it's like you get the elevation gain out of the way quicker, and then it's like a long downhill. Mm-hmm. But it's like a 40-mile hike, and I do it as like my own pilgrimage, not toward any holy site, but as like a conscious practice of, for me, it's especially about like bringing awareness to the people who suffer from psychological suffering, from mental health challenges. And like, maybe it doesn't affect anyone else but me, but like that's enough for me to want to do it. And I try and do it in an artistic way, in that like it's full of intention and free of expectation. I don't know what's going to happen along the trail, but I try to apply these principles, right? Of like time in nature, physical suffering, mental suffering, a foreign environment. And it seems to impact me. Like every year I have a new and challenging but beautiful experience with it.
Yeah, when you expose yourself to these elements that you're talking about, you learn more about who you are in those elements, right?
Yeah.
You'll never discover those facets of yourself without that new context, perhaps.
Yeah.
It's one of the things I have to continually remind myself of when I've been disconnected from nature in particular. Mm-hmm. For a long period of time. I was just skiing up at Sundance a day or so ago. I was with two of my brothers, and just, like I forgot how I feel up here. And and maybe it's a reminder of how I've gotten used to how I feel when I'm in a sheetrock box for, days and days and days of artificial light. Like it's also a reminder. It's almost like a reminder of a more free or childlike version of myself when I'm in nature. The constraints are gone. I feel more primal. I feel more real.
Totally.
If I step back and look at like what I've learned as a psychiatrist in school and whatever, I think just all the Western like facts and tidbits and protocols are important, but like I think I attribute more important wisdom by far to the age-old practices, like the medicine woman who would see someone who's depressed or disheartened and say, like, when did you stop communing in nature, or singing, or like being enchanted by stories, things like that, that are like it's something so simple and right there, yet it's so easy to forget. It's kind of grounding, healing, reconnecting powers.
Yeah, it's like we've increased in the West so much our technological capabilities, which is amazing, right? The fact that we're like using these microphones that are connected to wires. I mean, I don't understand the first, like 10% of what's happening technologically with what we're doing right now.
Somebody did this.
Yeah, exactly. But maybe like our wisdom hasn't like kept up with that same trend, right? So like, and that's actually the reason I stopped using an iPhone. It was like, it was too much for me. It was like, I felt like it was more powerful than like my self system was able to deal with, And so, thinking of like, what are the practices that help us increase in wisdom? That's another reason that I like try and make art every day, is because it's a way to spend my time, right? Like, and maybe that's another definition for art, is it's any sort of artifact that expresses how someone chose to spend their time. Like that to me is fascinating in and of itself. Like, especially with the mud balls, right? When someone's like, wait, you spent how many hours over 2 or 3 weeks to just shaking a mud ball? It's not obvious that that's how any of us would spend our time.
That's beautiful though. And to be able to recognize that, the iPhone has too much power for my psyche, may not be the most like serving what I am trying to create, right? And my oldest son, who you've met, Dallin, did that as well. He, not the iPhone, but with like social media and a lot of tech for a while. And it was just really neat to see like that disciplined kind of counter approach to society, but what it made space for, like to be able to cultivate like so much, not just what you can create creatively, but what you can find and become.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's whatever it is you're like, it's like getting pulled into. I think it's like a good reminder to just take an inventory of it. And because I found myself as a painter sometimes, right? Like I had a chapter of time where I was painting a lot more and murals, like big outdoor murals. And then a time where I was not painting. And it's interesting to look at, sure, I still loved consuming art, like appreciating it. But then like the minute you start participating again, it's like it lit up a part of my soul that was like apparently dormant and apparently a part that I quite like, you know?
Yeah. Do your listeners know about, like, have you talked about your art on here before?
No.
They need to know.
Yeah.
This is new info about Reid.
If you are in Utah, if you're ever in Utah County and find yourself in Provo, if you drive down to the Provo Temple and the big new skin $20 million fancy building, right next to that's like 100-year-old brick building. In between those two, with a kind of a 2-story pixelated Einstein mural on it, and that's one of them. That it's been selfied by many thousands of people. And
so cool.
You did that?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
I didn't sign it on purpose. Because I just like this. Like for a lot of reasons, like the pixel art style, but I like this outdoor kind of participatory, like flattened hierarchy of street art, and it was sorely missing in Provo years ago. Yeah,
that's awesome. So I'm picturing something weird right now. In the spirit of creativity, so we're talking about making space and following the muse and what can be labeled creative or the creative act, like an increasing sort of the basket in which something could be tossed in there as creative. But and your point about the iPhone, like I'm picturing this sort of celestial body moving through space and the gravitational pull of other things sort of pulling it, and that its journey being dictated by these gravitational pulls. And it's not a very intentional journey, right? We're just sort of being jerked around by all these different things that capture our attention and make us feel good or help us at least not feel bad. And that you might want to take an inventory of your life and get a sense for what are these things that have this really intense gravitational pull in my life, and do I want to keep them in my life? Might I experiment with what life is like when I don't have something, and discover, oh my gosh, like it was pulling me away from who I am, or was pulling me away from people. And also making me think of, I'm just sort of brain dumping now, but things that could be considered creative that maybe I hadn't thought of before. Like a large part of my identity is father, as a parent. I've got kids. And that parenting can be a creative act. Of course, as a therapist. And so, I also teach, and people ask me advice on things like parenting, but I also teach other therapists how to do therapy. And sometimes I find it difficult to explain why I do a thing. Yeah. Even in sessions that went really, I would say especially in sessions that went really, really well, because it feels like I am channeling something. And I've filled the hopper of my mind, of course, with lots of training and lots of study and lots of practice. But maybe that qualifies then as a creative act. For
sure. And before I say anything else, I want to like put a pin in the image you just created for us of that celestial body. Like, you or someone else should depict that, I'm so interested in that visual, because it really resonates, like the things that pull us in. And I think that's like what it's like Clayton Christensen language, but like that's the job we hire technology to do, is to like do the work for us, right? And again, there's so many beautiful examples of that. Like we all drove here in automobiles and cars. It's like that's great, right? And that's useful. And like gone unchecked, we start to use our cars because that's what we do. It's like all of a sudden it's this dogmatic way of living life rather than a creative, intentional choice of like doing something different just to see what happens.
Yeah. Remember why you hired that tech for that job, or remember why you allowed something into your life for a certain role. And remember your sovereignty, that you are actually, we forget that we're the boss that hired that tech, right? But I love this hurling through space analogy too, and just the reminder too of like, as you're hurled through this disorienting kind of black hole of space or whatever and tugged in all directions, you best be anchored by some values and like know what they are. Yeah.
Well, if I could get even weirder, the word remember to me, I like it in juxtaposition with dismember. So if we're being pulled in all these different directions, the process of remembering is like putting ourselves back together, like remember who we are as opposed to being dismembered.
Amazing.
I'm glad we're having you on here.
A religion out of this.
I'm thinking all kinds of creative thoughts.
The sign of a good podcast is when a new religion appears.
That's right. I've been meaning to start a cult. Maybe this is,
What shall it be called?
The remembering.
That's amazing. That feels like that's going to change that word forever for me. Of just like, cause it's like, that's a visceral image of like the dismembering, right? If we're thinking literally, but like, pulling yourself, coming back to yourself. Who are you really? And like, I'll get off my soapbox in a second, but like, I'll just say that like everyone has a unique perspective, right? And like, I'm saying this selfishly as much as anything, that like, I want to know how everyone sees the world. And therefore I want everyone to make art, because that's like one of the most direct ways to like tease out how we see the world. Yeah. And like the cliche cheesy version of that is like, your perspective matters, right? But like, I really, really believe that. And I love so much when people make stuff from that place, because it's not competitive. Like, we all benefit, right? When you share your perspective in a beautiful, unique way,
what a beautiful,
beautifies the world.
What a beautiful way to see the world too, with everyone as an artist. Yeah. Some without a medium. And and to like believe in that vision of more people following that creativity and what that looks like.
Yeah. And there's a question I like to use to like invite people into that space. I got this one from our mutual friend, Thomas McConkie.
Cool.
Who like in meditative practice, he's taught me this prompt, which is something like sitting from that place where you can honestly answer the question of, what would you do if there was no problem to solve? Right? Like, if you can embody that, let everything else fall away, and I'm just like feeling my breath right now as a reminder to do it myself. Just like, what if there were no problems to solve? From that place, what happens, right? Like, what do you want to do or not do?
That feels like capital P patience.
Yeah.
As you describe
I think it does.
Yeah.
Or presence. Capital P presence. I mean, it as soon as you finished that sentence, I felt a mixture of panic. And then also peace. Like this really interesting apparent dichotomy.
All these P's.
Yeah. Create our own list of P's.
And I like that, like coming back to where we started, like the capital letter thing. It's almost like what do you call it? You guys probably know, like a dodecahedron, but like with infinite sides. What is there a name for that? Like a tetrahexagonal. I don't know. Imagine
an infinite one.
Tesseract.
A shape with
it's called Indra's net.
Okay, there we go. Basically, any geometric shape with infinite sides. I imagine that like any capital letter word is like one of those sides that's pointing at like the source of all creation, right? Like, and so whether it's patience or presence or any other number of P, or, capital C, creativity, or capital G, God, like they're facets, they're faces of like, the same thing in a way. But I think it's important that that we have because they're like different poems, right? It's like different ways of, it's a different flavor of the same thing, maybe.
That's beautiful. I'm lost in this kind of infinite jewel of Indra's net and the diamond luminosity of each of these, like each of these capital lettered precepts, if you will, shining and bouncing off everything.
Well, Haymitch, one of the things you said in your introduction, creative mediums that you played around with is writing.
Yeah.
And you were generous enough to give us a gift, a copy of this book that you wrote called Friend of the Devil, a story of mental health mistakes and self-forgiveness. So maybe we can wrap up our conversation talking a little bit about that book. Yeah.
Thanks for bringing it up. I would have just sailed into the sunset of capital letter words, without thinking about it.
It's just so intriguing. Tell us what Friend of the Devil is about.
Which I'm realizing now has, at least the title is all lowercase letters.
Yeah.
And the subtitle is all caps.
There we go. We got the best of both worlds. So this is a book I self-published it in last year. Gosh, I think April I think it was June. Sometime last year. Self-published it. It took 6.5 years to write this book. Essentially what it is it's like a biographical analysis of the story of a friend of mine named Cameron White. We still are dear friends to this day. We grew up together playing, Little League sports and went to high school together. And when we were seniors in high school, he was driving under the influence of alcohol and went across the road and crashed into another car in oncoming traffic. And in that car was a family. And in the accident, the pregnant mom and 2 of the kids died. And the dad and another son survived. And they had another son who wasn't with them in the car. A lot of people from the Salt Lake City area will be familiar with the story. It was just like one of those devastating things that ripples throughout the community, right? And everyone has connections to someone that was involved.
I remember it well, in fact, in Sugar House, because I lived around the corner, and because like the dad who died in there was like a really respected and fairly well-known church leader in the neighborhood. Like he's a bishop, right? Of a Mormon ward in my neighborhood. And it was just shocking and hard. One of those hard things to process because like how does it feel to be anyone involved?
Yeah. Totally. And you said the dad, I think you meant the mom that died. The dad.
Oh yeah. Sorry. The
was the one who like survived, but then like 2 days later publicly forgave Cameron for that's sort of the miracle of the story is that like how do you what does that even mean to like forgive someone who's done this to you and to your family.
He was the bishop, right? And lost his wife and child, right? So I misspoke, but that I think everyone in the community was kind of on the edge of their seats and like awestruck by that act of forgiveness.
So the way this book came about was Cameron, my dear friend, who was a teenager at the time, fast forward 17 years, reached out to me and asked, like he felt for a while, he and Chris would go like do speaking engagements together, which was really powerful. But I think it was always hard for Cameron because it like reopened that wound, and Chris even told him at some point, like, you'll need to move on from this to find healing.
That's nice of him to see that. Have that wisdom.
And every interaction I've had with Chris has been truly amazing. I mean, and he even says that there's a video online about it where he says, I don't want it like any of the goodness that Cameron was experiencing through the forgiveness. He's like, I want you to know that's not me. That's like capital G God coming through, right? Like that's
capital
something.
F forgiveness.
Capital F forgiveness. That's something else that's working here. Something else is calling the shots. he's just like a humble, beautiful man. And I'm grateful he wrote one of the forewords to the book, as did Cameron. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition. But the story just sort of, so Cameron reached out to me about wanting to, he had stopped speaking, and after a number of years, he felt compelled, to still want to help out. And so we came up with the idea of doing a book where he wouldn't have to, put himself out there, but that we could create a book and that would perpetuate the story and the message of forgiveness.
Beautiful.
And also get into some aspects of mental health and mistakes being made from that place. It's easy to vilify Cameron, obviously, in this story. And my hope with the book wasn't to disregard any of the responsibility that he fully, owns up to. But by delving into some of the mental health aspects of his story, I do think it helps explain why in many cases teenagers turn to alcohol. There's that element of just being a teenager, trying to, rebel and figure out what you believe. But in his case, it was deeper than that. It was like he was covering up a lot of his clinical anxiety, And so, again, it doesn't absolve him of any responsibility or guilt, but it does, I think, shed a clearer light on what was going on. And then so the book is essentially from that point, just exploring his story and his path of self-forgiveness. And I've certainly woven, at a book signing, someone asked, they're like, well, how did you keep your fingerprints off of the story and tell it as clearly as possible? And in that moment, I realized that my fingerprints are all over this thing, for better or worse. I've tried to weave in stuff about meditation and about art and different things.
Yeah, it came through you.
Yeah, that's it, right? It's like, for some reason, Cameron reached out to me to write this book. And for some reason, I was in a spot of willingness or openness to say yes to it, even though I had no idea how it was going to come together.
As it was whizzing down the mountain, you just caught it and said, sure.
Exactly.
Buckled up for the ride.
Most creative ideas, right?
Yeah. So,
and I think it turned out. I think after Cameron read the final manuscript before we went to print, he said, this makes me want to get back out there and share the message more. So that was the stamp of approval. I felt like I had done right by him and done right by Chris, and hopefully it's a lasting artifact that helps, even one person, and particularly young people, just who are dealing with mental health, or are dealing with addiction, but really I hope it's for anyone. Yeah. That's
beautiful. And forgiveness, it just reminds me of how liberating it is, true forgiveness, for everyone involved. You could live a life of self-loathing after making a mistake like that, right? And in fact, think of how hard it would be to forgive yourself, and how much forgiveness do you ever get? How much help with that do you get from the world? Right. But I think especially at a young age, and the developing brain, and how many mistakes young people can make, how many teens have driven drunk and not swerved and hit someone.
Right.
And it's just even when I heard you telling the story now, I feel the same tears well up about it that have come up 100 other times just from that existing in the world, that story. So I think it's beautiful that you gave it a shape like this.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that. And also maybe a final plug for the creative act, or for creativity in general. You never know what's going to move through you, right? And how that's going to impact the world and impact others, and impact you. So to build on our broadening definition of art and creativity, I think a broader, more inclusive definition of forgiveness is self-forgiveness is important too. That just as art is our opportunity in every moment, so is forgiveness and self-forgiveness.
Yeah, I'm so glad that your fingerprints all are over this. Like, to whatever extent creativity, like we've been discussing, is channeling something, it's through the prism that is us. And so it's going to be distorted and shaped by the different facets that make us who we are. And so I imagine it's an incredible addition to this story to have it filtered through the prism that is you. And probably be especially applicable to people, given the way you talk about it. And this is me not having read it yet, just having heard you describe it. But the different sort of twists and turns and colors that you give it, given your experience with mental health and meditation and creativity. So what a gift. What a gift to the world.
Yeah, you have to let me know what you think after you read it.
Yeah, maybe I'll take that back.
Yeah. It's like, oh, this is
never mind.
No good. That guy that talked about creativity is not very creative.
Oh, I'm really excited.
But the fun thing about creativity is it's contagious. It feels that way.
Yeah.
And, one of the selfish reasons why I wanted to have this chat with you on the podcast is because you're a fun guy to be around. Like you
thanks.
radiate like this positive energy, this positive, like you mentioned your love for life and the way you see people as artists. And so, thank you for sharing that with us and being inspiring in the way you live.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be here and to have anyone, reflect that back. That feels great. So
feeling is mutual. For what Reid expressed, that I felt the contagion of creativity today. It was inspiring. So thank you. Hopefully the audience feels similarly.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this and being here. And thanks everyone for listening. Till next time.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous Network, a company committed to helping people heal and be well by delivering technology-driven clinic support, clinical trial research, and comprehensive practitioner training in psychedelic-assisted therapy. You can learn more about Numinous Network at numinous.com. That's numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. You can leave a rating or review on places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, subscribe to the Numinous YouTube channel, like the YouTube videos, and share the show with somebody you think might enjoy it. If you're interested in comprehensive training in psychedelic-assisted therapy, check out our courses at numinous.com/training. These courses are carefully crafted by Numinous professionals like myself, Reid, and others, and include live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space. I really love teaching these courses and connecting with you all, so check out numinous.com/training, and I hope to see you at the next training cohort. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Please consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.